don't know. I'm sorry, say that again. Oh yeah, so for the positions, myself, I'm the chair, Graham is the vice chair, and Mary is our secretary. Vince is, as a staff member, was at the meeting, but does not, if I'm correct, does not have to attend regularly, but it would behoove you to attend since education is part of your charge. Oh, thanks, Mary. Sorry. Oh, we created our mission statement, which is very general and broad, but it's to create or provide educational materials and outreach opportunities on multiple coastal resilience topics to audiences of Nantucket's diverse communities. So basically, we just set out, as we discussed at our various meetings, that our educational materials will both be physical brochures and things that we can hand out, but also educational opportunities or outreach opportunities that we can give oral presentations to the community and recognizing Nantucket's diverse communities.
Cool.
Any questions about the education subcommittee?
I will note that the name of the committee in the minutes from the last meeting was changed at the committee meeting with input from town staff. So it is a subcommittee, not a working group, as stated in last meeting's minutes. Okay. Update on potential Civic League Forum participation. Vince, and we have Tom here from the Civic League, so whichever one of you is prepared to speak.
I'll just give a quick outline, and if Tom wants to provide any more information or update, that'd be great. So, actually, as we start, Tom starts with Liz Tribus, who proposed this idea to the Nantucket Civic League, and I think Tom is the person designated to run this.
Vince, would you check, is your mic on?
Better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Liz proposed it, and Tom is now the person responsible for it and is developing this. So it is proposed for Saturday, the 8th of February, and it's going to be approximately in a 2-hour event, 3 to 4 speakers, each person speaking for in and around 20 minutes with questions. I have already committed to giving a presentation. I think there's 1 or 2 other people, Jen and Sarah are going to be talking as well potentially, and I'm going to try and see if I can find 1 more person to talk about historic preservation, as Holly Backus is not available that day. Does that about cover it?
That's pretty good.
Tom, do you want to add anything, a message to the public about the forum, or since we're being recorded, that will be available?
Do I need to go to a mic?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
There.
Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tom Sidlowski. I'm on the executive committee of the Civic League. We're going to have a forum from 2 to 4 on February 8th to address coastal resiliency. The purpose is to inform the public more about what's going on, what the scope of the problem is, and what the town basically is doing about it, and other groups are thinking about it. So it's going to be open to the public, and we'll put out some advertisements in the paper and other places so people know what's going to happen. Typical of a Civic League forum.
Will it be held here?
It'll be held in this room.
Okay.
Thank you, Tom.
Can I ask a question about that? Yeah. So I did have a question about open meeting law, like because it is a forum, so it's not just us presenting, it's a forum where people can ask questions, and we won't be discussing topics necessarily, but because I'm new to town committee, I was curious what the parameters are for that.
Sure. So that's pretty simple. I will post an agenda saying members will be present. I don't know if we will have quorum. There will be no meeting or anything formally discussed, but it will be posted to cover us.
Okay, great. Thank you.
It's hard to hear you, Vince, when you're speaking. You're far away from the microphone, I guess.
Okay, Gary, I'll try better. Any better?
Much better, yep.
Thank you, Gary.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if there is a quorum present, then you have to announce that in public that there's a quorum.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, I'm glad we have that on our radar. Update from Vince on requests for proposals for the Coastal Resilience Plan. Vince, would you start by saying where we are in the process of issuing that RFP and what the committee's role is at this point?
Sure. So I have sent out one part of the request for proposals to the committee. This is the scope of services. This is the bulk of the work that is to be done. Section 1 is incomplete, and that will be is for town admin and procurement to fill in, as are the sections further down beyond scope of services. So effectively now this is pretty close to the finished document. What I need now is everyone here has hopefully had a chance to read it. Are there any major concerns? Is there anything that you think is unaddressed, left out? I'll do my best to explain where some issues stand, and I'll basically just kind of open it up to the floor to take whatever suggestions people would like to see added, fixed, amended. Peter.
All these reports I read, based on what the mission of what we are, but I also have an editor's eye. So I found a lot of things that I hope you'll let me, maybe I can just send them to you so that you don't send it in the way it is, because I thought that there was a bunch of things that needed to be addressed.
I agree. There's some factual errors. There are some logical errors. There are typos in
I mean,
one word substituted for
12,000
another.
people year-round. The Nantucket data platform says 17,004 or 500, something like that, and maybe 45,000 in the summertime. And I mean, there's a bunch of them. I'd rather not just pick it apart now, but I'll send you the document highlighted so that.
Sure, I appreciate that. But just to cover points like that, I said over 12,000, so I'm trying to be as reasonable as possible. Nantucket Data Platforms has one number, Census has another. I'm trying to provide a minimum.
I would
give an estimate for what the town is like, not describe the island in detail.
Okay.
I would also point out that over 50,000 has no factual support either. So it concerns me in the same way that it concerns Peter, that there are errors in the document that I could not see going forward. I'll point out the reference to seal level rise, which would be interpreted as an increase in the seal population, which we do have, but it's not the purpose of this document, and that happens more than once.
That's a typo.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon?
Vincent, most of these things are really simple. They're just, you just need to, when you're inside a document, you've written it and you're sure that it's right, you've been looking at it for so long, just needs other sets of eyes, that's all.
Well, thank you. But just also point out that I am not the only person involved in writing this. That this has been through 2 rounds of internal review, and I am sorry if I've misspelled the word sea to seal. It is just a typo.
Well, it's, okay, so you mentioned the Civic League in there. So, maybe it's a fair bet that someone who has done this type of work before that knows Nantucket is going to get this document, but lots of people will look at it. You should properly call them the Nantucket Civic League. It shouldn't be a colloquialism. So, stuff like that. Just little stuff like that that'll not tarnish your credibility and Nantucket's credibility. That's all.
All right, thank you. So can you send me that list? And
I'll send you the document highlighted so that you see where I'm talking about.
Sure
it,
thing.
And you can
So
do
in terms of major content, is there any question?
Well, I don't want to gang up on you here, Vince.
Yeah. Well, no, it's not a gang up. This is kind of, let's see what people want. This is the purpose.
Where you say on the first page that more than 30 houses have been moved or lost to the sea since 1980. My guess is it's probably well over 80 rather than 30. And if you look at Sconset, if you look what's happened in Matticat, and on Concom, I mean, I've been on it for 8 years now, and I would say we have between 5 and 10 and maybe even more houses a year that want to be moved. So that's an example of where, without wishing to dig too deeply into the weeds.
Yeah, it's also accurate to say that, over 30 is 1,000. So I kind of went with minimums where I could so that there wouldn't be too much scope for interpretation. I did try to just give a basic overview, not an in-depth.
Yeah, well, if you want me to actually have to start counting, I think it would be more accurate to say over 80, and it gives a sort of different level of interpretation and meaning to people who don't live on the island and who are reading the documents.
Okay.
And maybe just to go to Ian's point, one of the things might not just be houses lost, but houses moved,
Right.
shifted, a little bit more to the complexity of what that erosion issue is out here. That might help.
Because that is sort of, what we're talking about
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, erosion is just as big a piece of this issue as sea level rises and flooding.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I just had, I wanted the committee to have a chance to discuss the target of 2100. So I know that some of the different presentations we've had dealt with whether we're targeting like sea level rise projections for different years. I really like that we went on the, personally, I like that we went on the outside of it to aim for those kind of the bigger picture sea level rise. But I didn't know if there also needed to be some context for, I don't know how you want to say it, but I was thinking if there's also 2050 for certain things, because I think if we're having the consultants and they're coming up with a list of potential projects that we can pick from or that we can kind of jump on as funding allows, we want, some are going to be, I imagine, some will be a little bit more shorter term and some will be the longer term. So I don't know if we want to have that narrative in there for the consultants.
All right. So how would you rephrase that?
Yeah. So sorry. The first time 2100 comes up is on page 2. Sorry, I'm rereading. So it says, 2100 at a minimum for structures, I think. And obviously we'd like things to last longer, but I think, I'm not sure. I've only read through this once today because we just got it late yesterday. So I think I can come up with something in between now and the next meeting. I'm just on the spot. I can't come up with it, but something along the lines where, recognizing that as the consultants work through some of this, there's going to be short-term solutions to some issues and longer-term solutions to some issues.
Okay.
And like where possible, 2100 can be the target, but
So there was 3 reasons for the timeframes. 2030 was the first time frame used. That's only 10 years away, believe it or not. So that's kind of the short term. That's kind of, well, in relative terms, near term. It's further down. It's not in the purpose section. Then 2050, which is 30 years away, the life of an average mortgage, which is why that time frame was chosen. And then 2100, end of century goals, is the other reason.
sorry, I didn't notice the other timeframes. I only saw 2100, but that might be in parts that we are not privy to.
No, it's all here. This is everything and it's just further down. I'll find it now.
Okay.
But basically, this is to be hopefully at least to 2100, and if better, a multi-century approach.
I worry, so I just wanted for the whole committee to be able to talk about it, because I think that I would hesitate for the consultants to not consider certain projects because they don't have that 2100 life timeline. And I think without a specific project on the table, it's harder to kind of conceptualize that, but something like, I don't know.
So
this
it's
is why we have experts that are going to come in the room and present things. But
So it's 0.4 in C. So if you're going to C, then it's 0.4.
Yeah, I don't have page numbers on mine, which makes it a bit awkward.
6 of 14.
But I'm
No,
on
I agree.
C right now.
I agree with
they're
what's
light in the
being
bottom of
expressed that if there's too much focus on 2100, even in our public education program, people are going to say, well, 80 years later, that's not a problem for me to worry about. And so, and from what I recall from some of the presentations I've seen from some of the groups talking about rising levels of water around the the island, that by 60, maybe 50 or 60, they're going to be very significant issues that the island will have had to deal with. So somehow we have to try to have a balanced view. 2100 is maybe one way of looking at it, but a lot of important things are going to have to be decided and done well prior to that far out date.
Yeah, that's why I included two other dates of 2030 and 2050.
I would make the point that multi-century is out of our jurisdiction. Matt had a point, what should we be expected to pay for it? And I think going out 80 years is enough. I don't think that multi-century is something that we should take a look at.
So that was a point that came up with came up in a couple of meetings. That's something I was trying to address. Is that the lifespan of some infrastructure is only 50 to 80 years. If you can have a piece of infrastructure that can be adapted or have a longer lifespan to cover sea level rise to even longer than 80 years, that would be preferable, not needed, but preferable.
I think the uncertainty in what is going to happen to the world, whether we make changes or not, whether we have domino effect impacts, I would hesitate to pay a consultant to consider the incredible range of possibilities going out past 2100.
I would agree with you, and I mean, from Scientific American to New Scientist, all the publications on it, it's just there's such a wild swing of possibilities going further than that. I take your point about how if you've got an infrastructure project that can last 50 to 80 years, if you can add on to it, that might be a good way of building something so that it can be added onto. But I personally think that the 30-year frame is what is going to be most important, especially in competing for federal dollars and state dollars at this juncture.
And I agree with what everybody says, and the focus is 30 years. But I think that beyond that, we should at least give people a place who are going to be on in our places eventually, a jumping off point. It doesn't mean that we have to do the full thing that we're doing for the 30 years for the years that come after that, but there should be some general, beyond this point, we recommend that you might try this without being too specific, to at least give them some ideas, since we're the ones that are taking the first plunge to do this. That's all.
I would say that something like the phrase designed for adaptation could accommodate the idea of infrastructure life being extended through modification. But I just, to ask a consultant to address things happening that far in the future is either incredibly expensive or incredibly useless.
I take your point, but this isn't just for infrastructure, and we would also be looking at asking the consultants about what pieces of town bylaw might be required, or what amendments might be required to take us to at least 2100. There's a lot of bylaws that the town uses that are that old or older, so that they were well written in the start. We should be aiming at things that could be well written to carry us at least that far.
I don't think anybody's disagreeing with you, Vince, about going out to 2100. I certainly think that going out beyond that is, just too much speculation. And I think we should be using the maximum estimation at the moment of 10 feet of sea level rise and use that as something that we should factor in at every level.
That 10.1 feet is for 2100.
Yeah. I think we're all on the same page about 2100 being the maximum.
And I think one thing, because I was agreeing with wanting to plan for the worst, right, or the projected potential worst at the 10 foot for 2100. But I think one thing that, in terms of the, I just was hoping for some narrative in there, or at least a point where for the planning, or like the stage where we're asking the consultants to come up with projects. I know, like, when we looked at was it the Stratford Resilient Plan, the place in Connecticut?
Yeah, that's it, Stratford, Connecticut.
Kind of they have, like the multi-timeline where they had 2040, 65, and 2115. So we could do it at like the three timelines that you have, but just kind of being explicit that those are sort of the different timelines to come up with projects for, and for planning for, because the infrastructure, yes, we want to last as long as possible, but some of the parts of the plan where we're going to have to address different issues aren't going to all be infrastructure, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think I'm sorry.
I was just going to chime in. I only had about an hour to read this before the meeting, and so I'll read it more in depth as well. But I think so maybe a little bit of clarity in that purpose area, that the paragraph that Sarah was looking at on page 2 would help outline what's coming further down and kind of check off some of those boxes, so that the overall scope of what we're looking for is kind of presented in that first area and then broken down farther on. Because as I read through the next, set of pages, the gist that I got was that we were primarily looking for infrastructure solutions to our, infrastructure to protect our critical infrastructure. So coastal resiliency solutions that were on that more infrastructure side, and not necessarily the ranges in between. And as Sarah saw as well, pointing out to that 2100. So I wonder if it just makes sense within this purpose to outline a little more closely that what we're looking for is an analysis of Nantucket Island-wide for what the risks are for sea level rise, storm surge, and erosion, because that's not in that paragraph. And looking at that for both key infrastructure, but the island as a whole, for impacts from now until 2100. And then after the risk analysis, what are our solutions, ranging from doing nothing, moving, natural solutions, infrastructure solutions, and then the cost base. And so I think just like almost bullet point laying out, this is what we want, and now we're going to present the details later on, because it got lost in the larger document.
So I think a lot of what you're asking for is presented later within the risk assessment part.
It is, but there's a lot of information in there, so that specificity, I think, gets lost. At least in my reading of it, and I need to read it again. But that was, I just think that clarity piece might help focus the consultants a little bit.
So I worry that I would end up having a purpose section B here that would end up being quite long and then be repeated again later on.
Right. I think you only need another paragraph.
Okay, maybe we can talk about that a bit more.
Yeah. That's.
Maybe you can offer written suggestions.
Oh, I definitely can. I don't know. But that was just from my initial reading, without reading in depth, that was the impression I came away with.
So just to point out, once this had gone through a couple of rounds of negotiation with the people within the town, Chuck, Holly, Greg, they all had about the same kind of comments. They said, wow, this is 14 pages long. This is insane. Normally, these are half that size. So...
Well, I'd say that's irrelevant. It needs to be the length it needs to be.
Exactly. That was what I came back with, quite rightly so. But I'm also hesitant in adding in more paragraphs if I already have the information in elsewhere. That's the only point I'm trying to make.
Right. No, I understand. I don't think that we necessarily need to make it longer. We might even need to be able to tighten it up. We want to make sure we give the consultants exactly what they need and tell us exactly what we want coming out. And I think I think you're definitely getting there with it. It's just the first time we've
So in terms of content, so we've been kind of playing around with just the introduction section. Interestingly, this section here about available resources I presented in the 17th.
And for instance, if somebody is concerned about length, I could see the point 2 and 3 being offered as an appendix.
Point 2 and 3.
The resources.
The resource
available.
listing.
Yeah.
It's because you're not saying right here that they must read all of these documents and comply with them. You're just offering them. So I could see that being taken out to a separate piece of paper.
So I appreciate that, but if we say that they must read them, that's being quite prescriptive, whereas...
I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying we're not saying that, so therefore it doesn't need to be in the core RFP.
Yeah. Also, I'm also kind of curious as to how the document and when the document that's going to be compiled is going to come together, because I need to mention that in here as well somewhere.
Specifically, which document are you referring to?
The, for want of a better way of saying it, the Cliff Notes document.
Right, the one that the committee has agreed to
Correct.
work on. Okay, just making sure we're else understand.
So so most of this is introduction, talk about stakeholders and everything, and then before we actually get into the project scope in section 3 and talk about how they're going to gather their data and their public engagement, does anyone have any issues with those sections?
Only with the data gathering might need to expand beyond the town's data gathering, as in CZM and the SLAM data. There's other information that's statewide but relates to Nantucket specifically. And it also doesn't mention interacting with local experts that might not work for the town but might have information that would be useful.
Do you want to address that in the paragraph 4, project stakeholders, the last sentence? There are also a number of special interest groups, advocacy groups, and organizations to consider. You know, maybe we can offer to consider and potentially, you know, consult with, or, you know,
I think,
don't know if that helps.
I mean, not to speak for Jen, but I think that in terms of really specifying in the data gathering part earlier, because if we specify what they have to use for the town, I think it would be good to make sure to have a point, even a separate bullet point that says, it doesn't say who you have to go to, but that local expertise should be considered, not can be or may be, because I think that we on the island, know our island best in some ways, but then also that there's additional, as Jen said, there's additional state and national data that has Nantucket specific information that could be valuable.
Right. And there are more organizations than just the town that have reports that would be valid for the consultants to look at.
I appreciate that. This section was originally about 4 times longer because I'd named about every organization I could find, and then the thought was, what if you forgot someone? They'll only get annoyed. So I had to bring this back to yes. So then I started looking at just stakeholders, not what the stakeholders have. What the stakeholders might have would come under data gathering. So I know that's kind of hitting 2 categories, but I just kind of need to figure out who exactly they should be talking to initially, and then whatever data they can come across or we can suggest or put to them later.
So,
And
Madam
go ahead.
Chair, so this was sent to me at 5 o'clock yesterday evening. I got to read it at 10. I didn't even finish it at 10:30. I, would move that we actually talk about it we all get a chance to read it carefully and for the next meeting, because I don't feel that I can really give a sensible evaluation.
Thank you. And so Ian's made a motion. Do we have a second? I'll second. Any discussion on that motion?
I think that I think it doesn't. I wouldn't want to cut off discussion, because I think some of what we're talking about is important even now for those of us who have read it.
So Ian, do you want to clarify? Did you want to stop discussion or
No,
continue today
sorry, I didn't mean
until
it that
next
way.
week?
Sorry, but I do want to be able to send in to Vince or to share what we think of it going forward when some of us have had a chance to read it closely.
So we
maybe
have a
I jumped
motion
the gun there.
we have a motion to continue discussion today and at our meeting next week before
Yes.
cutting that off.
Yes, please.
Okay, and I'll second.
Does that slow our timeline if we give it another month? Or?
That was my
No,
question.
week.
Yeah.
Week.
So I'm hoping to get this out by the the next meeting.
It's a week.
Oh, a week. Okay. Yeah, that's.
But I'm still hoping to get this out sooner rather than later. There's already been significant delay in.
Well, I think this is the very first time we've seen it, though, and I would really, really hesitate to rush something that we're going to be relying on these people for, our charge. And so if it's our charge, I feel like I would find putting the brakes on it. And
I'm not so sure about that myself, if I'm honest.
You've been living with this for a long time, Vince, and we have just seen it less than 24 hours.
right.
And if
Actually-
our charge from the committee, from the select board is to work with these people and come up with a plan, I feel like we need to be able to fully read it. And
I agree. This is the primary focus of what we're doing is this. And I think that this is where our input right now is most valuable, is in what this is going to be and what we're putting out, and it's going to impact what comes back and how we're interacting with the consultants.
Technically, and I hate to have to bring up this justification, but this is what I'm putting out, and I will take your recommendations, but it is on me to put this out, and I will look at your recommendations, but in reality, this one's on me.
I'm not 100% sure of that. You mentioned in the document that it's the responsibility to work with the committee, and the committee has oversight.
Sorry,
so
which document? I'm sorry.
in your RFP. So
There's not much point in having this committee if that's we're just told, well, okay, we're going to show it to you, a few hours before you sit down, and that's it. So I completely disagree with you, Vince.
Vince,
So,
Vince, we're here to help the town, but we're also here to help you do your job. And if you show this to us, then we can't help but go over it with a fine-tooth comb and make it right, because it represents everything that we're all thinking on, how we want to keep the town above water, and it's a very important document. We have to have more time. I mean, it's ultimately all on you, but you need us to help you do it. That's I think what everyone is saying.
All right. Taken.
all right, so back
Talking
to
about,
Ian's
talking about waiting a week or waiting a month.
a week, Gary, a week. Our next meeting
week
is
is fine.
yeah.
I'm
That
fine.
should be fine.
I'm fine with a week.
Are we ready to vote on that?
I won't be here next week.
Okay.
I'll happily take suggestions via email.
Voice vote, Peter? Voting,
Yes.
Jen?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
Me, yes.
Yes.
Yes. Ian, yes. Okay, so we have a unanimous vote to allow for an additional week for review and to continue our discussion at our next meeting. Thank you. We will also continue the discussion now.
Here's a question. Are there any, this is one thing I've thought about, are there any of these resources we want them to use? And are there, so some are optional. Or if there are any that are not optional, maybe they're in the, if there are any that we really want to make sure they're using, they should be in the document. Maybe the rest can go to the back.
So you're in section C2, I'm guessing.
Yeah, C2.
Okay, so
I'm just thinking of a way to shorten it,
Yeah.
but also add the things that people want to add, but shorten it. If there's anything in there that, Vince, you think is really important, or anyone else thinks they have to use, or is it all optional?
So part of the problem, no, it's not all optional, and I want them to use everything as much as I can.
Right.
However, can't force them. That we have to be careful about being too prescriptive.
Right.
So we're going to provide them with everything. Then they'll have to take in as much as they can. For example, there's a couple of things that I don't know will they even be able to take in because they might not be ready yet. Under Section 3, there's a couple of plans there, like the Climate Action Plan that's detailed for this year or next year. I'm not sure will that be ready in time. So I don't want to force them into using a plan and delaying us because it's not ready.
And I think that might be on us to make sure that their plan dovetails with our other plans.
I tried to catch that in several places. I need them to dovetail with the Resilient Nantucket Design for Adaptations Plan, and I also need them to dovetail it with the Climate Action Plan, even if it's only being advertised at that point. I think that has to get advertised sooner rather than later as well. But, because it hasn't happened, I can't guarantee it.
The other question I had, because it was a note on here about the years on some of the plans. I know some of them are listed, like the Nantucket Master Plan is to be amended in 2020. But even like the Coastal Management Plan is quite dated now, and not that there's not good information in there, but like I would not want them to completely rely on a plan like that when it's, is a little bit older. So,
So yeah, with the Coastal Management Plan, I was hoping that won't get updated, but we only have what we have. just to point out another one that I was really hoping that would be done, the beach management plan, that was from 2004. That is properly old in terms of management plans, and it got rewritten last winter, and it's not quite there yet either. So, you know, I'd love for that to be available. I was kind of hoping, well, could we at least provide them a draft of that plan so that they could have the most recent? But this is kind of the situation we're in. We have what we have, and if we can get them newer data as it comes online, or even drafts, that would be fantastic.
Well,
but I can't promise it, so I can't be too prescriptive.
No, I'm not saying that we have to promise them and update all the plans. I just think providing dates of the plans for all of them would help that with the judgment of whether or not you use it. You know, like if you see a plan is from 2004, that might be informative. Or
I take your point, but I'd hope that they would use it anyway. But with, say, a grain of salt, thinking, oh, well, this is old and hopefully going to get updated.
right.
I'll make a comment on the beach management plan, because I was going to say this anyway. That's a perfect example of a plan that was well done and updated for a number of years while we had a strong committee. We had the Beach Advisory Committee working on it, and that languished when there was no more citizen involvement. So that's a perfect example of, you know, sometimes the staff wants to do everything, and they can't. You know, or they do it and it's not accepted, or they do it and it's not popular, and they didn't think about the things that are, you know, need to be thought about at that time for all different reasons. And so I just think it's important, like as an example of how to, anyway, you know, that was well done in its day, and it dealt with a, you know, at that point we were stopping driving on the beach, you know, a few years earlier than that, really, the substantial driving, and it was really a flashpoint. And that committee dealt with all those complaints. We were closing a bunch of beaches to driving, and they had, you know, people who drove and fished a lot on the committee, and it really worked. So I just think, don't forget that that's, you know, how these things have to happen. You know, and the other point I wanted to make earlier, I didn't, was I think, Vince, I think the point you have over 100 years that is good is for like policy, not necessarily setting policy, but setting sort of the principles. It's important. If a principle is, oh, geez, you know, the town's going to pay for everything that anybody wants, then we'll be doing that for, you know, can we afford that in year 10 or 30 or 200 years from now? If a principle is those impacted are going to, you know, pay X percent, or like if there's some principles in there on how we pay or how we deal with it, those may be the things that will go on for the next 100, 200 years. You know, I think there's a lot of expectations now that the town, that everybody else will pay for the people, you know, the 5 people that are having an issue. It's easy to say no to 5 people. It's harder to say no to Matticat or no to Grand Point on certain things. But at some point you have to say no. So when do we say that? And how do we say that? And that's where I think you're onto something, because that would be kind of principles. It could be bylaws. It could be regulations. You know, that's where I think he has a really good point. Is it, you know, sort of, so.
Thanks.
I had another area, Vince, that I wanted to ask about.
Can I?
It's skipping ahead, so Jen, if you have something.
Yeah,
to
just
ask, go
real
ahead.
quick
Yeah.
on the reports and information. I think
Sorry,
supplying
which
all of
section?
the resources.
Which section, sorry?
Page 3, what we were just talking about with all of the available town resources and reports and things. I think it's great to, you know, put a list of everything that there is, just like what we have on the website. Here's everything that we have. You can take it. I think detailing, as we've said, if there are things they have to look at, because you definitely say in here later, you don't want them to redo the flood calculations and models. All of that's kind of already been done. And so I think maybe just breaking out from this, those things that here are pieces of reports that have data that you don't need to recalculate. So like the storm tide pathways, all that GIS data.
Yeah.
These are the ones we have that you need to use in your analysis. And I do think that
Wasn't that one of the points of the Cliff Notes document, the abstracts document?
Perhaps I wasn't here for that discussion.
Oh, beg your pardon. So there was 7 or so documents that the committee was going to, certain members were going to take a document or 2 each, write about a 1 or 2 page abstract, point out the important things for coastal resilience from those 7 documents, which are all in this first section 2 here. And then I was going to hopefully include that as a resource document within this, so that the consultants would effectively have cheat sheets know exactly where to go for that information. So that was the point.
Okay, well, I guess that kind of answers what the discussion was here a little bit earlier. But more to the point, I guess, was that I was, we're saying all these things have dates. Some have limited information, some have better information, provide it all. But if there are key pieces that they have to use, and that comes back to thinking about the storm tide pathways, inundation stuff. And then I also think we should provide to them, we outline kind of broadly what we're saying for sea level rise, but if there's a resource of that information, as in CZM's sea level rise calculations for Nantucket, use that data. We should outline that very specifically in here. And as well, CZM has the SLAM analysis data for Nantucket as well. There's just a couple pieces of data that tie to reports that we could say these are the pieces you have to use for your projections. And it's mentioned broadly as you go through, but maybe not with that specificity of this is exactly what we want you to use for doing your work.
Okay. All right.
Does that run into issues with telling the consultants too much what they have to do, or?
I hope not.
Yeah.
If we're forcing them to use, say, one particular thing, for the sake of argument, Stepley, we can't. They might want to use something else, something that they have found to be more reliable for their work in the past. But for CZM stuff, that's pretty much the basis.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
I think if that's what we're wanting them to do, and not wanting them to do their own analysis, again, which we refer to in here, but I think laying it out pretty specifically, but you can also put a small caveat in there, unless the consultants have found a more applicable method, which they can then bring to you and ask if it's acceptable. I mean, that's a very standard way of putting that into RFPs.
Sure.
One thought, sort of on some of what I think we're talking about will be sort of sorted out as the process is underway, as they're writing it or asking questions. And then under K, under reporting, it says it will work closely with town staff and the committee, and updates are fine. But I sort of think we may want to name, we may want to name you, Vince, as the contact. Because you don't want them getting some info from somebody, some from someone else. I think we have to sort of specify who's the boss here, so who's going to work with them.
I take your point, but that's actually in a different section that I don't write.
Okay.
So that will be one of the prescribed things, say in section 1. I've only done, say, section 2, what should be detailed. But I will be the point of contact.
Because
I think that it doesn't name me specifically; it names my job title. But that's just the way that it works. Yes.
I want to make sure of that, because
no, that's certainly the way it will work.
yeah, good. And then I'm not so concerned about some of the things we're talking about.
Right.
Because if they pull out something and it's not appropriate, hopefully they're working close enough and be able to say, no, this is better, here you go. So,
I agree.
all right.
All right, so skipping to the section E, resilient strategies, proposed projects and plan implementation, proposal deliverables. This is page 7. You're saying that the deliverables need to account for Massachusetts state law, et cetera. I want to make sure that they have the opportunity to recommend changes in the law, if such would be required to protect the island.
State law?
State law.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know if the language here suggests that that is possible.
I'm just going to skip down a bit because I think that's dealt with in the policy section. Just bear with me 1 second. I'll find it and I'll call out the name and page. Yeah, I. So that this section I, page 12, that doesn't mention anything to do with state policy, but yeah, I can see what you mean there.
How about where there's a difference between state and Nantucket policy? Should we be saying, like, just mentioning? Anyway.
Sorry.
Wait.
So, and then conflicts is what you're saying, conflicts.
Well, I'm not. You're one. There's two different things. One, we're saying, if there should be state law that's changed.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that there are some laws that are different here than they are in the state of Massachusetts.
There should
Beach rights being a main one.
Okay.
Are different, and so they have to understand those, because some things that we can do here with the you know, the proprietors being the select board approval might be different than what you could do anywhere else in the state. So,
No, that's
anyway.
why I was using the word conflicts between, say, town and state law, or differences, I suppose, would be a better way of putting it, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's, yeah.
Yeah, but there is no mention of, that's the point about.
Ian, can you use the
there is
mic?
no mention. There is no mention of advising a change in state law. It's strictly on, the way I read it, local law only.
Yeah. Well, this is what we can affect locally for certain, or potentially affect anyway. Affecting state law is something that I hadn't considered at all. So that's something that I will work on.
Yeah, I just think
good
that if there's
suggestion.
a project that provides a tremendous level of benefit but would require a change in the state law, we want to make sure that we're aware of that potential project and not have the consultants not tell us about it because, oh, we couldn't do it under current law. I would want to know what that option is.
Fine. Yeah, I made a note. I'll work on that. So we were working on section E. I know I jumped down to deal
That
with it
was
in a
E.
much different section,
Right.
but that's where I would see the appropriate place for dealing with it. So anything else in section E?
So I guess when you say there, each specific recommendation will include, you might add a bullet point, conflict with any existing laws or changes proposed for any existing laws or something like that.
I'm not sure I understand.
So in section E, you're saying that the plan needs to include an implementation section that needs to include specific recommendations, and each recommendation will include, and then on page 8, you have a list of bullet points about what should be in that recommendation. And I don't see here that there's anything regarding the law as it applies today to the recommendation.
So yeah, this part here is largely about infrastructure, and then skipping down to section where we added that comment a second ago, beg your pardon.
Aye.
Section I is where I'd probably deal with that. Page 12.
Well, section I says development criteria for private landowners.
Yeah, and new planning and policy guidelines is probably,
So I would want this to be addressed in resilience strategies, proposed projects, and plan implementation. So it should apply to everything. You know, where does the law stand, and would we need to make changes in the law in order to implement the project?
Well, in the very first paragraph, you could just add a caveat saying this needs to account, it says this needs to account for Massachusetts state law, including, and then the two laws. And you could add with the recommendation to modify the law if deemed necessary. Something as simple along those lines, just added in the first paragraph.
Gary, did you want to offer any comments? I want to make sure you have a chance.
No, I'm listening. If I see something, I'll speak up.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Additional sections? Do you want another couple of minutes to look through, or we're no immediate rush?
So, like others have said before, I haven't had a chance to go through in as much of detail as I wanted to, but one thought I want to bring up were the areas, like the recommended areas, and I don't have the solution. I just thought it would be good for this group to talk a little bit about not so much how the coast is broken up, but how much of the interior is included. As we've seen from when we presented some of the work before, that through the inundation and storm surge, because of our long ponds extend so much into the interior of the island that actually quite a lot of the island is susceptible. So I know that there's a caveat here, like the eastern interior and western interior, and that it says consider selecting a distance from coastal areas or elevation. But I think I would like advocate for having it be completely island wide, and obviously the areas that are vulnerable will come up in the vulnerability assessment. So I don't know if it's worth further limiting the area to be even assessed in this section. If we just have it be completely island wide and then they do a vulnerability assessment first, then that will already target the areas that need projects.
So-
And that might include some of the interior.
The best way of trying to explain that is that this is a recommendation, not set in stone. It is for the consultants to decide how to break up the island. If this is a method they choose to use, great. If they want to go with something else, that's kind of for them to decide. I just wanted to give them as much scope as possible. A recommendation first, and then as much scope as possible to break it into whatever manageable chunks that they would base it on. Where I ran into some problems in trying to figure out what they might do as a recommendation is I had to work with what's in the RFP for the Resilient Nantucket Designs for Adaptation, which takes in the historic districts within the town centre itself and also Sconset. So they had to be included so that there could be resilience efforts taking place in those areas that are not within the RFP for Resilient Nantucket Designs for Adaptation. Love that name. But I also had to wonder how they could break up the coastline. There isn't really a set way of breaking up the coastline other than there's, if you look at the harbour plans, the way that the Madaket Harbour and Nantucket Harbour are broken up is largely based on the harbour plans. After that, I just broke the outer coastline into 3 main sections, just to kind of, for want of a better way of saying it, do something with it. But again, this is just a recommendation, and it is for the consultant to decide how they would like to break it up.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I think it's good that we're talking about this. I think it's, and I'm just saying this from my experience with the sewer projects. It isn't up to them to decide on how they break it up. I think we decide so that our plans are consistent from now into the future. And the reason I'm saying is that the consultants named, Pulpus. They called one thing Pulpus, but it wasn't Pulpus. Mm-hmm. So there was a couple terms they used that were different from how we view it, and everyone was confused forever until we changed it, until we made them change it. But then they had to change all the documents. So I think, you could get their input, or, if when they come back, whatever happens, however it's named, has to be consistent sort of going forward. And so just think about that. I don't have the answer, but
Neither do I. And that's my point. Yeah. And hopefully, just an update on something else completely different. The Malone and McBroom report should be along soon, but the way that report broke the island up was into 26 different neighbourhoods based on electricity distribution grid areas, which didn't work. Yeah, exactly. That's the point.
Yeah.
That's useful to National Grid.
Pretty much. But after that, it kind of stopped its useful life.
Yeah.
And
I know.
for
That's my
Malone
point.
and McBroom to use that didn't necessarily work. So, like you're saying, Matt, I don't have an answer either. I have a suggestion.
So I want to follow up what Matt said, because looking at this now, for instance, Madaket with Tuckernuck and Muskeget, a project in Madaket Harbor would have 0 impact on Tuckernuck. So I don't see any logic in grouping that as one area. Going from Low Beach, Sconset to Great Point, I mean, that there might be some environmental consistency there, but
just to address that first one on Madaket Harbour, the Madaket Harbour Action Plan includes Tuckernuck and Muskeget, and that's exactly what that's based on. Okay. I had to stop at Mass Ave at the end of Smith's area because that's where that plan stops. So that was the logic for that. It's based on a pre-existing plan.
well, I think that being more prescriptive in the areas rather than less, and giving them specific names I think that would be beneficial so that we all have a common language. But I think it's the local understanding of our island that should inform those names and those areas.
Point taken, but if the consultants decide to break the island into 100-meter or 100-yard sections, and they choose to, and we accept that, that's what we're just going to have to work with. We're going to have to find out what the consultant recommends, how they might choose to break it up as well. Being overly prescriptive at this early stage might mean it could be very difficult to hire consultants.
I hear you. I think perhaps what we might remember is that one of the first things we should do after the consultant is hired is agree on the areas that they're going to address and how they're going to break them up. It seems vitally important.
I'd argue this whole report is vitally important, but yes.
It makes the outreach very difficult when you're talking about two different things.
Yeah.
And I
agree.
So this is only a suggestion, and I have really no idea what they're going to come back with.
Mm-hmm. I do think that we're obviously going to be hiring a consultant that's not on island and potentially not familiar with the island. I think that if we provide a recommendation, they're most likely going to use it. I think that, or at least focus pretty strongly on it. And so with that, I did have some initial comments, but I'd like to look at that map a little more and think about it a little more. So I think if we can have, maybe when we meet next time, a little bit of discussion on what that breakdown should look like, because I think we will have to work with it in the future.
Fair point. Yeah. Those 10 areas were also included in that's only point 1. Point 2 and point 3 bring in what I've called targeted subdivisions, and they can break it down into much smaller areas as they please. And then this point 3 was also aimed at what you were saying about great ponds and low-lying areas that will eventually or potentially flood or maybe open to the ocean over time. Anything below a certain elevation, I think 10 feet might be a nice elevation, but I think I've also left it up to the consultant to decide that number.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then I have a question. You have eastern interior and western interior and a dotted line. Is that dotted line of any particular significance, or is just a randomly drawn?
The Surfside Road.
Okay.
It's going to be the UN line.
Well, that's actually pretty. I thought it was pretty close to where the water flows two different ways.
Yeah. No, that wasn't it. I just picked a road. But I also see that's kind of what's it called? Myakama Pond does cross a little bit of that line, but it pretty much goes into the creeks just a bit to the west of where to the east of where it all joins in.
Yeah, it's close to where the water Myakama flows one way, one direction, and one way the other side. The only other comment I had to make, just general comment, was we asked for them to give an estimate on what the cost will be, but I think it should also be like there should be what's the cost, but what's the best practices, or what are the options to pay for it? Because that whole issue, is we did this with the sewer. We came up with it's going to be $90 million for the sewer, but there was then we had to hire someone again later to say, so when they're doing this, we should also be thinking what's the best way to pay for this if we're going to do it. It may not even be worth doing, but
if they have recommendations for it, right? Like, so there might be projects they come up with that they don't have an idea of. I mean, I don't know. Is there going to be a definite cost breakdown and possibility for each one?
I just think I think if we ask them to be thinking about that, then at least it's on the radar. If not, otherwise it's just a bunch of huge numbers.
Yeah.
And,
I've just added a point to work on that.
Talking about the funding, it's so important. What is our thought as to how we're going to be able to get the best advice as to what kind of federal or state funding might be available? Is it not going to be the job of these consultants who give us assistance on that? Do we have to hire somebody else? What's our thought on that?
Lobbyists. And I think it's going to come down to that.
It's actually
as a comment. Yeah.
No, it's actually on me to find grants. It's part of my remit. So.
And I think that's gonna be iterative too. Like the state has some things now. It's gonna be the federal administration is gonna change, and so everything's gonna things will be constantly changing and updating too.
It's a really salient point because it's obviously going forward is going to be colossally expensive, and there's going to be a lot of communities fighting for a smaller and smaller pie.
Well, I look at it from, I'm sorry, you can go.
Go ahead, Gary.
I just want to know, so it was not your thought that these consultants would actually give us advice on to what avenues of funding are available from state or federal resources?
That's largely my responsibility. I hadn't considered that too heavily for this project. So yeah, effectively, I hadn't really put much thought into that.
I think if they have ideas, especially for certain projects that they might propose, it would be great to have in kind of like that table form, maybe like Matt was alluding to. But I think that my assumption is that similar to the plans that we've read already, there's going to be a list of projects, and we're not going to obviously be able to tackle them all at the same time. So some of them might be farther down the road when funding opportunities have changed. I think that the things that are sooner that we can get onto, they'll probably have recommendations that exist currently, but that's going to be changing pretty regularly.
I think in the context of this proposal, we're asking for scientific, engineering, technical expertise. We're not asking for financial government expertise. Is that a fair statement, Vince?
Pretty much. But I don't really have a problem trying to see if they can research potential funding sources to make a recommendation. But that was something that I've already started doing and identifying funding sources because I'm just going to have to try and get a bankroll for us together at some point. I know that Matt has also talked as well about, a potential pool of money that can be drawn on. I don't want to rely on that, so I'm having to look at an awful lot of different options. Largely, this is something that I thought that I would be dealing with myself later, not that a consultant would deal with, because this is largely
This is in
engineering
your
and
job
policy.
description. Yeah. Matt, you weren't going to add something, or?
Yeah, I'm just using my experience from, the sewer. It's one thing to say we need to sewer-matic it and, this and total daily loads and nutrients and all this. Then there's the reality of how do you pay for it. And so we're going to have, that, and that's somewhat minor compared to, I think, what we're going to be dealing with here in some ways. And so I think, as much, as much as we could figure out what the principles are, or we can get help with them saying, these are funded by, this is all FEMA, this is whatever, this is what, if they have things that they say, this can be done sooner because there's money for this.
Yeah.
I think the more they can be thinking about not just what are we going to do and how much they should be, and approximate what it might cost,
Yeah.
but where could you get the money? That could help us do more of it more quickly.
Yeah.
And so anyway.
Yeah, no, you're right. I
agree
take that
with
point.
you. But, I would like that sort of input if they have the ability to give us that sort of input. There's no question. And, I'm sure that the more help you have on that subject, the better going forward.
Isn't that very important when we have to make decisions as to which type of project we wish to go forward on, and we have to choose between one or the other? Isn't the fact that we may or may get funding for one and not the other, isn't that going to inform us about how we can make that decision? And without it, how do we make the decision if we have no idea how we're going to pay for one or the other, and just choose blindly, let's do this one, even though there may be no money available anywhere to fund it?
Well, this also comes back to the point just above in J, project necessity, and this will be something hopefully similar to Stepley. I think it would be worth thinking about looking at the way that the hazard mitigation plan works. That ended up with something like 55 different recommendations, and the way that worked using Stepley was some of them were said, they were ranked necessity, some were just urgent and already getting funding and starting to progress through their financial support. So I would think that it would end up working somewhat similar to the way the hazard mitigation plan has worked. I would think that the selection process would be somewhat different because there's going to be a committee helping with selecting, whereas I don't think with hazard mitigation there is.
I'd also point out that the time frame for the deliverable is 12 months. And assuming that this is bid before November and awarded, the federal administration will potentially change in the middle of that time frame. So asking for funding sources could be a difficult thing to accomplish in the time frame we're allowing.
Well, I'm not
Is that
sure.
a prediction?
Potentially, I said, Gary, I'm not making political statements, just looking at the calendar.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
my view is hopefully that we'll get this advertised within the next couple of weeks. It'll have to be advertised for something like 45 days.
Right.
And then once we get the responses in, we'll have to reply to consultants within a time frame as well. It's usually 30 or 60 days, something to that effect. But we're looking at roughly, say, something like June.
Right,
For her.
that's my point.
Yeah.
Is we political events could upset the apple cart in terms of available funding halfway through their
Yeah,
consultancy.
a lot of things could go wrong, but
Yeah.
we have to just proceed as we are.
So suggestions on funding would be great, but we wouldn't want them to limit their proposed projects by the need to recommend funding.
Yeah, and there's always new funding streams coming on as well.
Exactly.
That's something that I'm always looking at. I'm on more email alerts than I care to mention for funding sources.
All right, let's pause for a minute. Are there members of the public here who have questions or comments on what we've been discussing in terms of the request for proposals for a coastal resilience plan? Edie, you want to come up to a mic and introduce yourself?
Here. You can use one of these if you want.
Edie Ray. I like the idea of slowing this process down a little bit. Having been at a lot of town meetings where people make amendments to a carefully thought out document that in retrospect turn out to be not exactly what the person had planned. I think having you guys have the time to really study this and maybe email Vince specific changes in the wording or whatever it is you want, I think is a really, really good thing to do. I know Vince has put a lot of work into this, but new eyes on a document is never a bad thing. So thank you for doing that.
Anyone else has something they want to add? All right, thank you, Edie. All right, from the committee, anything else?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, Gary.
Mary, there's another piece of this document that Vince hasn't finished yet. Are we to see that in time so that when we talk at our next meeting, we'll be able to look at the other piece as well?
Once this gets completed, it goes to procurement and it's out of my hands. I don't think I'll even get to see it after this section is complete.
Yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Vince, that what we're not seeing is the legal language around the contract part of it as opposed to the specifications for what we're looking for. And it's not something where we would have standing to comment on.
Yeah.
Okay. Matt's nodding his head, so I'll take
Yeah,
that.
I think, yeah, and it'll probably be in a select board, you
Yeah.
know, when we're gonna act on it.
That's true, yeah.
At some point, if we're gonna act on it, we'll see it. Or we may even have to vote to put it out, if Libby can't do it straight. But
Can I ask a logistical question?
Sure.
Who actually interviews the candidates and hires them? Is that Libby? Is that you, Vince? Or is that the select board have input in that?
So the way that this works, once this has been advertised, is the consultants, whoever they may be, 1 to 10 consultants will respond, and they'll send in 2 documents. This is all kind of detailed in section 1. I've only read it from other RFPs. I'm not really sure how it's going to be phrased for this one. Usually it's section 1, the first section is the one you open first and you leave section 2 closed. It's a sealed envelope. The first one is just dealing with the scope, how they would approach this, what their input is going to be. The second one is, and it covers all time frames and all that kind of stuff. It gives pretty much their whole response to just this scope of services. The second part remains sealed. You judge the first part and you give a scoring criteria, and it's usually going to be a committee of 3 or 5 people from town staff. and I'll just have to try and find enough people, either 3 or 5, willing to review those documents. Then once we give our responses and we say, look, which document, which company would be most advantageous, then you open up the second set of documents, which is their financial proposal, how much they're going to do it for, their budgets and all the rest of it. Then that gets judged separately by mostly by the finance department, I think, by procurement. And then between what is considered advantageous and for the best price is how it gets selected. Then we get to put out an offer.
So who combines the two?
Yeah, that's, I guess, what I'm asking.
So mostly procurement with input from me and the 3 or 5. But yes.
It
Who are the
doesn't,
3 to 5 people?
it doesn't necessarily have to be all staff. I've been on committees, we've done assessments where 1 or 2 people from here could be part of it. You know, we did that with housing. And some of it is, it's sort of, it's how they, and it can get tricky sometimes. It's how it's written sometimes. And sometimes it's written in a way that you have to follow this, you grade everything and you have to follow it strictly. And if someone got the highest grade, you have to give it to them, depending how you wrote it.
Yeah.
But if you write it that, you can write it to put more leeway into it. Because what happens is all the people that apply are going to have attorneys and they're all gonna, answer it in a way that's the most advantageous for them to get the job. And sometimes you find after the fact, you've done all this work, and then you look and go, wait a minute, these 3 criteria are all about the same. And we should have just had one question and we forgot this. And do we start it all over again? Or, I've had times where I wonder, like it's a tough because you might look and go, we really want to hire this guy. That group was perfect. They really understand it. And you go, well, you can't. I've had situations where I've been told, no, you can't, because these guys were higher. So I think we want to make sure it's written in a way that we know which of the criteria are most important, and that we're able to pick the ones that the best fit.
Correct.
And so it's tricky. It's not.
Yeah, it is a complicated process, and because you might think, oh, this company is offering everything, they're going to do a really good job. Then you open it up and they've added a 0, and it's $100,000 or $200,000 more expensive than everybody else. Suddenly they've just lost.
Yeah.
They're off budget.
So I guess the
Thank you.
point is to keep in mind that you could recruit from the committee for your review group.
And we probably should, because there's a couple of people here who have experience on some of the scientific stuff, especially that most of the town staff and most of us here don't. So, anyway, I'm not pointing at people.
Okay, and any other comments today? We do have another item on the agenda I want to make sure we get to, so.
I'm good right now. Thank you, Vince.
Okay.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Vince.
thank you, Vince.
And please email everything that
Yeah.
you think is relevant.
Okay.
So the next item is discuss establishing, wrong. Discuss a recommendation to the select board on town review of development plans in coastal areas, such as under Concom jurisdiction or FEMA flood zone or some other definition, to include potential coastal resilience strategies. And this agenda item is a response to several requests from our last meeting. Do you have those? Yep. Yes, you do. Great. Thanks, Vince. Vince, do you want to kick this off, or?
So yeah. Matt had made a few points about the potential yard sale and losing some properties. There was also mostly talked about Harbour Place, and also Gary had made some points about potential bylaw requirement changes. So myself and Mary, when we're looking at potential agenda items, we saw these 4 as being somewhat linked, and this could be the basis of a recommendation to the select board. Effectively, how the town could review development plans before they get approved, to see if there's any potential for a coastal resilience strategy or any coastal resilience type elements, particularly in low-lying areas or within areas that are vulnerable. So I'm kind of having a bit of trouble with how it might work. Would this be within Concom jurisdiction? Would it be within the FEMA flood zone for the sake of argument? Or should it follow some other potential things like such as storm tide pathways? It could be another way of viewing it. But if this committee could come up with a recommendation to the select board for how to, would you say, slow down, add an extra layer
how to
of question?
include additional review.
Yeah, it's an additional review, essentially.
Vince, I would say, I'm sorry, all of the above, everything you just mentioned. I mean, think of an example would be Wilkes Square. We all know that property owner is considering doing a development there, despite what we know of sea level rise. So the more the merrier.
Yeah, you're right. But the point is, you can't be so prescriptive to talk about just one property owner. If you talked about how we're talking in a FEMA flood zone or within the Concom jurisdiction area, that could be one way of addressing it. And then say the Concom would then, or another appropriate body, say in planning department, could then say, all right, could we consider a coastal resilience strategy as part of this site development?
I would think you develop some sort of protocol of each one. It would be site specific, I'm sure, and so then the one that mattered, that would be concerned the most about it, you'd start with that, and then if you needed to go to that next agency.
Okay, so just not asking for a vote, because I don't think that's my place to ask, but does there general support for this idea that there could be a recommendation to the select board about development in low-lying areas?
We have an agenda topic,
yet.
so we'll continue the discussion. I don't think that's really a question.
Because of comment when you're.
Yeah, I'll see, Rick. I'll get to you in a minute. So, Peter, I'm trying to understand exactly what you're proposing is basically to say that we would have a list of criteria, and any property meeting any criteria on that list would be sent to a specific board to address that criteria, or
Well, it's whichever board would be, it would trigger that would have the most, I'm searching for words, but it would be most pertinent for that board to review it.
so we'd have to come up with a list of criteria and then a list of the board that would be responsible for managing the response.
Yeah, and are we talking about something that we put in motion before the plan is done? That's what this is about?
That was Matt's suggestion
So
on the
it's-
17th, yes.
Right.
So just to kind of at least see if there's a way that we could start looking at coastal resilience in low-lying areas, particularly around critical infrastructure. And I always like to talk about Easy Street and Washington Street, so I'm going to pick on them again. What could be done in some of those areas just to have them be a little bit more resilient?
And, yeah, well, you can pick on them.
Isn't this the consultant's job? Isn't this?
Well, yes, but before the consultant gets to this, because like we're looking at least a year and a half before there's a consultant in place. This is to address some of the potential developments that Matt was talking about, such as Harbour Place, and but before.
Yeah, well, and it was also, I think the town administration had some inquiries about, I think sort of the, what do you call it? Down Brant Point, the Brant Point area, and they bounced all back to us, and we aren't quite ready to, we aren't qualified or ready to handle it, and so that was the reason. So we aren't really. So there's nobody really charged with this yet that I can tell. Within all the various parts of town government, there's nobody that is the point person on this or owns this. So there's no go-to person. So this stuff is happening based on state rules or based on how we used to do it or whatever. And so the question is, how do you, is it review from here eventually? Is it, I don't know. Does it go to?
So just
In different aspects are different. Like the yard sale program, we might be selling, strips of land to the water, and then are we going to have to get those back? In the case of Harbor Place or Wilkes Square, it could be, there's a committee of us that are meeting and speaking with the developers, but I don't think we have enough the information really on what should we really be concerned about. Do we want, places for water to, be pooled and pumped out, or are we looking for breakwaters at the end of the pier so that we don't have storm surge? What is it that could happen there? What could even the asks and the concern? What are the concerns and what are the asks for that? You know, so like that's another example, or, you know, so it's different aspects. And I don't know. So I just wanted to discuss, how do we begin to get at the topic? You know,
So-
when do we get at it and how do we get at it?
So in essence, can we create some temporary guidelines because we have to wait for the coastal resilience plan, so that projects that are going through an approval process before we get that plan have some sort of review for impact on coastal resilience? Is that?
No, I don't know if I know the guideline. Like, if you
Well,
say-
and, we
Yeah.
don't know what the guidelines are
Yeah, I
right now,
don't know
but
that
can
we
we
know
create
that.
them? Yeah.
So just by way
Well, I
of,
think we're all on the same page about that, and at one of our earlier meetings, when we had the presentation that said that the regulations usually are way behind the actual needs for them, and thinking about that in the last week or so, in reading through the stuff that was happening, I saw two different items, one coming before the Conservation Commission and one coming before the Planning Board. And it was just one of the normal notices. And both of the properties that were being affected reminded me of issues that are our coastal resiliency issues. And I was going to call Vince Murphy and say, Vince, you know, we ought to be doing something about that, but we don't have any regulations or guidelines. And the question is, at some point, we need those planning boards and the conservation. We need the commissions to at least ask the question if we could ever come up with guidelines that were going to modify behavior. That would be great, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that. At least we should start getting those questions asked at the time the approvals are sought.
At least for the downtown area, we do have sort of a place to start, which was, I don't know, was it 2008, 2009, at town meeting, through zoning, we created the Harbor Overlay District, which is a basis on what can be built downtown on the harbor. So it might be a place where maybe amendments to that through zoning could be, that could be one place you could start.
okay.
I would, so because we're sort of waiting for the consultants too, and this isn't our particular area where we're ready to change legislation, I think maybe working within the committees that already have that jurisdiction, so the HGC, the Concom, the Planning Board, I don't know what else, the yard sale program, I'm not sure, there's probably more, but for all of these programs, maybe with the exception of the yard sale program, there's like the form to fill out. So like when you go to the HDC, you have to fill out the form, and when you submit an application to the Concom, there's a standard way you do it. Maybe there's a line that's like at least one question of, have you considered coastal resiliency? Or I don't know how to put it, but like when we apply to the state wildlife grants, there's like any of the state grants, whether or not they are related to coastal resiliency, there is actually a question on whether or not you considered coastal resiliency or sea level rise in your management planning, and your application scores higher or lower whether or not you've done that. And so I don't know, it's not entirely applicable, but I don't think we can come up with the same thing that would work for all those different committees, because they have different goals. But just to start to raise the question. So I think because it seems like down the line we might be recommending changes to some for policies or for town bylaws at some point farther down the road. But for now, maybe just starting to raise that question. I don't know how easy that would be to add a question to the HGC form, but
It's a good question. I don't know.
What if we had something like a flood and erosion vulnerability score? And so each property that came before a particular board for review, for development, would be scored on its vulnerability to flood and erosion. And then we'd have a scoring system that we'd have to develop. I don't know if one exists somewhere else, but.
No, first of all, one doesn't exist. I
yeah.
don't think I have time to develop one, and I think you'd probably have to hire a consultant to develop that, and that would be a completely separate thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be facetious, I'm just trying to lay it out, how it would work. I do see a value in it, but that could take 6 or 8 months just to come up with.
Yeah, I agree, but I do wonder, and I don't know that this is the way to do it, but just thinking about it, we've talked before about identifying low-lying areas. We could take data on sea level rise and the storm tide pathways and potentially come up with a map that identified properties that fell within what we considered a coastal erosion zone right now while we're waiting for, or not a coastal, but a
flood zone.
Yeah, exactly, a resiliency zone, an issue zone. And we could potentially go to those boards and ask them if they had applications within this area we've identified, that they then ask those applicants to demonstrate how they've considered the impact of these issues on their application.
I think it's overdue, but the bottom line is currently with the Conservation Commission, it's only the 100-foot line. So,
Yeah.
you know, we can look and think this is absolutely crackers that you're going to build there, but we have no jurisdiction. So the jurisdictional envelope would have to be expanded if Concom got involved.
Yeah.
Well, how
And
about
that's a bigger ask. But
how about a
Right.
combination of the Concom jurisdictional area and the FEMA flood zone area? It would take two significant envelopes in, and if there was a recommendation to say, look, anything that's developed within these two areas had just this extra layer of questioning applied to it. The problem is, if it's only a question, and how are you going to enforce it?
There's no enforcement.
I think I would be correct in saying that you'd have to change the state law and the local regulations so that Concom could then have jurisdiction. So this would be an example of where you might want to amend the state law.
Right. And at this point, you know, there are applications that are coming forward that would be within whatever that outlay is that wouldn't come to the Concom, but would come to the planning board. So I think if we're looking at something that we would want to do before we get our coastal resiliency plan that will help inform policy change, I think it would be just more of a outlining an area of interest and going to these other boards and just asking them, as we've said, to ask that question of if these proposals are considering something. And I mean, we can't enforce anything, but we could raise awareness, and we could potentially start to gather information about when it's being triggered and by what and what that looks like. But, you know, I don't know if that's something that this board could handle, the scope of that right now. Peter? I don't know.
And I know that we're not a regulatory board, but we are a committee of extreme knowledge in lots of areas, and maybe it's enough for now for when such projects come before the boards that have been mentioned, that you say you need to go and meet with the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee and hear what they have to say. Since we can't tell them what to do, we can certainly inform them. Since we have the knowledge, we know what's coming, or we think we do. I don't know.
Mary, do you want to have Rick speak?
Yeah, I
You
wanted to get the committee to have a
Yeah, but
chance
Rick
to-
might have a
yeah.
good suggestion.
Rick, would you like to?
He's been around it a long time. He might.
I don't know if this is working or not.
It's
It
working.
should be
Is it
on.
working?
No,
Thank you. My name's Rick Atherton. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to mention two sort of quick items, very much related to the discussion you're having right now. My sense is that it's important that the town start to deal with this on all new projects now, not, your plan might take 2 years, and then it's going to take another 2 years. And I would refer you, and I do this in the context that I have a citizen article this year about new projects within a certain distance of erosion impacted areas would have to waive their liability for the impacts of erosion and not be able to hold the town or its boards and commissions responsible for any impacts that they cause. That's recommended by town council to be in the zoning code of the town. And I think Peter was getting onto something here, the overlay district. And when I was researching liability waivers in other communities, all of a sudden you find out that many towns in California require waivers for all building permits within a certain area. You go to the island of Kauai, and they have a very extensive zoning and building permit requirement involved with their coastlines related to erosion. And people there also, when you get a building permit, you have to sign a liability waiver around the whole island, anybody who's building. And they have constructed a way to determine how deep that area is where the waivers have to occur related to erosion possibilities. And I think you'd find it interesting just to share, for example, the website. I'll send this to Vince. And Kauai is a good example, but there are lots of others. And they have a series of videos of how they establish their bylaws and their waiver requirements in their zoning code. And I think if you reached out to the planning board and the planning department, perhaps through the town manager, and said, this is something we ought to start sooner rather than later to protect our coastline from the impacts of erosion. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rick. It seems to me like waivers are, a potential tool, but they're not going to accomplish anything for coastal resiliency. They're not going to create any new infrastructure. They're not going to prevent any infrastructure. They're simply going to remove liability from the town. So I appreciate that, Rick, but I think we're looking in a different direction. Is that?
But what they do though is if everybody has to sign them when they do work, it puts everybody on notice that they aren't going to be bailed out by everybody else. I think it's
I think it's a good.
and it may not just be erosion; it might be storm pathways too.
Yeah.
It may be because I look at Matticat, and when we talk about the dump, and we're getting ready to spend $16 to $20 million, and I'm thinking, and I'm thinking, why are we going to spend all that money on something that 20 years from now is going to have the water lapping up next to it? So I just.
Right, and I agree with your comment on liability waivers, but you can easily take those building codes into setback requirements and all the things that go with it. That addresses some of the issues that were raised by Ian. And town bylaws can be utilized to have our building department permits recognize these features.
Oh, thank you, Rick.
The other thing that Rick brings up too is really looking to the other communities and what other places have done. And we've talked about that for the educational purposes and the plan specifically, but thinking about how other communities have, if they have put some of these requirements and the different levels of requirements, so like some of the things that we were saying that might not be enforceable, but start to get it on, make people more aware that, that where their building is in an area that's vulnerable potentially to erosion or flooding. So
Some of it is to make the town aware. The town just, did the Harbor Masters building for a lot of money, and and they didn't put it high enough, in my opinion. And I asked, why not? And they said, well, it would have to have a lot of ramps around it. And I'm like, well, okay, So I just thought, but it was too late. It was already so far along in the process that it wasn't going to be different because people are set doing it a certain way.
Right, and I think that's what we're trying to accomplish is let's get started now so that not only do we not have to wait 18 months, but the things that it's too late to affect 18 months from now also have no impact.
and part of our mandate is to like that education and outreach part. So if we can say, have you considered coastal resiliency or, coastal flooding in your new building, or even if it's not, if they say no, they're not going to not get to do it, but it kind of brings it to the forefront.
I like the idea of a conversation with the committee rather than just a question on a form where there's no information provided to the applicant when they just answer a question, but to have that conversation would be valuable.
And maybe this is obvious to only me, or maybe it's obvious to everybody else and it just dawned on me, but it sounds like we're headed toward a coastal resiliency overlay district for the whole island. That as soon as you enter this zone, then all these things come up that you got to do. It's not just a question of getting a building permit, going to the review boards and going through that, but now you've got a plan, not just on a federal level, but on a town level for the good of everybody. But one more thing, and I don't really want to bring this up, but maybe we're talking about a subcommittee of this group to create criteria. I don't know.
Just in order to try and avoid another subcommittee.
Okay, good. Thank you.
How about? It sounds like several people have some very good suggestions. If you could email me something, a written piece of a written recommendation that might go to the select board, and I can compile those. We can put them on the screen next Tuesday at that meeting, and then work on it together as a group for half an hour or so, just to get the actual text from the suggestions. How would that sound?
It sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
Okay, Edie, do you want to add something?
Thank you. Edie Ray, I think just to sort of pound home the point that Rick was making and some of you other guys, you ought to take a trip over Millie's Bridge to Smith's Point. I hadn't been out there for a while. There's several brand new houses being built out there. And obviously they're going to expect the town to pay for some way to get out there and provide the services they need if and when Millie's Bridge becomes inaccessible. So I think that it's happening right now, and I think the sooner you guys can get something into the brains of the people on these other committees that are allowing these things to happen, the better, because it's happening right now. Just take a trip out Millie's Bridge. It's shocking.
Thank you, Edie.
Thank you, Edie, because I have to say, almost every time I go somewhere I haven't been for a year or two, I'm astonished at what's going on. But of course, there is the provision in the local bylaws that post 78 houses basically can't expect any relief or any protection in terms of being protected from erosion.
Well, it's more than just the protection. They expect the services.
Right.
And the state law is very difficult in regards to roads. We basically have to put the road back at almost any cost. And that law will eventually change at some point, but right now it is very difficult. And when so that's there's a lot of liability on the town. And so that's and that isn't going away, unless we have them sign some liability, unless they sign it away. So.
So other comments?
Just one simple one. This will hopefully eventually end up being a recommendation to the select board, if you could frame it as such when you're writing it. I don't have any idea what length it should be. Maybe Matt might be able to provide some comment on that.
Well, the shorter the better. So, no, I don't. Yeah, I'm facetious, kind of, but it has to be fair. It should be whatever we're trying to do. We should be pretty clear and pretty concise, and something that's sort of doable short term. And I don't know what the answer is, but
So what I'll do is. The next meeting is next Tuesday. If, say, by next Monday, you could just email me something. I will put them all together as they are on a sheet to be able to be printed out to bring here. Actually, just thinking about this in a slightly different way, I have to be able to post the agenda 48 hours beforehand, so I actually might need it a bit sooner than that. I might need it by, say...
Monday's a holiday, so actually even sooner.
I need to post on Thursday. Is
No,
that
I'm
too
sorry. If I get am I on the right week in the
Monday the
calendar?
20th.
Yeah, Monday is a holiday.
Okay, yeah.
So would everyone here be comfortable with being able to submit something to me by Thursday lunchtime? Is that too soon? I know everyone works and is
But
busy.
do you need the details before creating the agenda?
no, it just has to be an agenda
Yeah, it's
item.
just,
Yeah, okay.
we can do the agenda item.
We can just make it an agenda.
Let's make
item.
it Friday, shall we?
Yeah,
Okay. All right, and then I'll be able to compile it over the weekend or Tuesday morning, whatever it happens to be, and we can just put it on the screen and work on it that way. And I'll also email everyone again afterwards for the members that are missing.
One suggestion, maybe we should have a copy of Rick's article for the special town, for town meeting too. Because maybe it's an amendment to that we would, maybe there's an amendment to that we could suggest. It may be too, I think Wednesday's too late to have it in the,
In the town meeting.
in the town meeting, but it can always be done after. So if there is, anyway.
Yeah.
okay.
So just as a comment, I have read that, and it is, just as Rick said, it would be a wonderful liability waiver, but that's all it would be. It wouldn't be much more than that. It wouldn't say cover anything for what we're concerned about with potential yard sale programs or losing Harbour Place or something to that effect.
Right, I understand that.
Other comments, anything from the public further on this topic? Yeah. Yes, please.
Say something.
Go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name's Annie Stackpole-Menz, and I'm a member of the Mattocket Conservation Association. And we have a subgroup, a work group we call it, coastal erosion. And we are working with the Nantucket, what's it called? Resources?
Natural resources.
Yeah, right. And we're gonna plant beach grass where the dune is being formed over the washover, toward the bridge. And I also am working with the Department of Agriculture, and they work with private owners, and my house happens to be at Millie's Bridge at the washover. And hopefully I'm gonna get a contract with them to put in some more beach grass, so at least we're trying to do something out there right now, even though, you don't know what's gonna happen next, but we are working on trying to do something with the erosion. So thank you.
And I think that's one of the points of the education subcommittee, is that it's not all up to the town. Private homeowners do have the ability to address some of these impacts.
Well, I was dumping leaves off at the dump this morning, and Leslie Johnson was alongside me, and she was bemoaning the fact, asking what Concom could do to halt people from doing donuts over the dunes where beach grass had been planted. So I realize this isn't our purview in this committee, but I just thought I had to bring it up, because apparently every year this beach grass is planted in the dunes, and then every year people drive over it.
Well, we're looking at that. We have a warrant that was written, a private warrant.
Yeah.
Somehow a control of some of the driving areas, but nobody's taken it on yet, so it's going to be sitting in limbo until somebody decides that this is something that needs to be done. But it's kind of like, it's one of those subjects that it's going to be very controversial.
I think that's where, as Mary was saying, part of the purview of the education committee too. We've talked about different, types of target audiences, and so we've talked about homeowners, like what homeowners can do. But I think there's a lot that we can do with like youth groups and in the schools too, because I think that's where getting at the younger generation as we move forward will hopefully care more about it. Hopeful. I'm looking at Edie's face, right?
I do have one small comment on this, and this isn't from my current job, this is from my previous job. And this is a major source of concern to me, is the driving on beaches. I do not wish to disparage our wonderful police department, and they are quite stretched, but this comes down to enforcement. They need to enforce the driving corridors, the speed limits on beaches, where people can drive on beaches, on public beaches. I mean places like Smith's Point, jetties, not the places like the trustees and NCF sites elsewhere around the island. But with on town beaches, you have to have a permit, and if you don't have a permit, you can have a fine. And even if you have your permit and you're on the beach and you're doing something you're not supposed to do, like driving in the dunes, you're also eligible for a fine. So it comes back to enforcement. Mm-hmm. And this was something that I brought up a lot when I was working with as the protected species technician.
And this is also where we're missing the Beach Advisory Committee.
Yep.
That was the committee that used to track this, and people would go and talk about it and complain, and they would make, they would talk to Libby, who would talk to the police, or they would talk to whoever. And, it's sort of, not disparaging the police or staff. It's, there's not enough time in the day.
Exactly.
I think that committee was really instrumental in changing the attitudes toward it, and I think you need to have that kind of thing ongoing. Mm-hmm. So.
Okay, let's, Edie, go ahead.
I think a lot of times we focus on the summer just because of the masses of people that are here, but a lot of the bad stuff that happens to our dunes occurs in the winter, because you've got the shorter winter beach, the shorter profile of the winter beach, so it forces, quote unquote, people to drive up onto the dunes. So, you know, we have people out on the beach trying to do the enforcement that they can during the summer times, but in the winter time, I think that's a whole another thing that we're totally missing, is that someone needs to be out there checking things out and fencing, I'm using the bad word, fencing, to keep the dunes viable in the winter.
I think that's a really good point, Edie, and even some of the other plant species that are diminished looking in the winter get driven over and things, and so I agree.
Yeah. And so, if I can, I guess I can say, I'm mumbling again. So, but Leslie felt that it probably wasn't students who were doing this. It was, you know, adults who should have known better. So.
Okay, any further comment from the public? Anything in particular, just opening it up? No, okay. Any other business from the committee?
I just wanted clarity on what our meeting schedule was going forward. I know things had to change because of upstairs, and I don't think I ever got the final. So we have a meeting next week?
Yes. So it'll remain the first and third Tuesdays of the month. The time has changed though. It'll be 10:45 to 12:45 in this room.
So starting next week?
Starting next week.
Yeah, it should have been on the 7th, but this the 7th we wouldn't have had quorum. And so this was an additional meeting just to make up for the 7th.
Okay.
So the only time the room's available on the second Tuesday was at 12 o'clock.
So just a reminder.
Okay.
Yeah.
Naturally.
Red letters.
So first and third, 10:45?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other business from the committee? Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Bye, Gary.